Hey everybody, I'm Chris Laps, and today I want to show you how to make some amazing drum beats on the Roland SP-404. Now, as far as making drum beats on a sampler, there's different ways to do it. One of which is that you can grab individual drum sounds as individual samples and load them up on different pads, which is what I've done here. But the other way is that you can grab a fully formed drum loop and chop that up, which is also a really cool way to make drum beats. But I want to show you how to make a drum beat from just the individual drum samples. So I went ahead and loaded up a full bank here with some different drum samples, and they sound like this. And what I'm doing when I'm looking for drum samples to load up onto a track is that I'm generally thinking either I want more organic sounding drums and more natural sounding drums, or I'm looking for more electronic, synthetic, digital sounding drums. In this case, I went with more organic, natural sounding drums. Some of them sound like real actual drum samples. Now, I also went ahead and grabbed a sample to put the drums on top of because for me personally, I like to have something already started and then put the drums on top of it, as opposed to starting with just drums. So the sample I grabbed for this case to put the drums on top of is this. And it's a sample that not only do I really like, but I can already sort of start to hear some drum sounds going over it and a drum pattern in my head. And that's a good place to start. Once you can start to hear a drum pattern, you can start to create that drum pattern on the device. So before I start doing that, I want to make a couple of quick adjustments to the drum samples. One of which is I want to send them all to the second bus as opposed to the first. And that's because I want to put some effects on that second bus that'll just affect the drums. And specifically probably a compressor to get a compressed drum feel. So in order to send them to the second bus, I just have to select that second bus, then hold remain, and then select all the individual samples. And when they turn green, that means they're being sent to the second bus as opposed to orange, which is the first bus. The other thing I want to mention that you might want to change is some of the pad settings. So if you hit Shift 15 to get into the pad settings, you've got different curve types for the pads here. And you'll notice that some of them are pretty drastic. Like this exponential one, you have to hit the pads quite hard to get a reasonable sound on them. But even this linear one, you have to hit them at 75 or 80% strength just to get half volume there. So I usually like to keep it on logarithmic. That feels the most natural to me. Because I typically play the pads kind of quietly with my hands, or softly, I should say, but I still like to feel like I'm getting a good drum impact when I'm hitting the pads. The other setting here that can help with that is this gain setting. So if you notice, if you turn it all the way down, you're not getting a lot of volume per hit. So I like to turn it all the way up. So it feels like something's happening when I'm hitting the pads. So let's go ahead and start playing some of the drums over the pattern and see what they sound like. Those have a really nice natural sound to them that I think work really well over this sample. But before I start recording the drums onto the sample, I want to make a few adjustments to the individual drum sounds. Specifically with the volume, some of them are quite loud. And then I also might want to change the pitch a little bit of some of them and maybe even resample with some effects. So let's hear what they sound like again. Like for example, this hi-hat, it sticks out of the mix quite a bit and sounds quite loud. So I'm going to turn that down a bit. Maybe turn it back up just a hair. That sounds better to me. I think I'll turn this crash down a little bit. And I might even pitch it up a little bit. It almost sounds like a ride cymbal. It's pretty low. That sounds a little bit better to me. One place where I would pretty commonly change the pitch would be on the kick or the snare. But these sound pretty good, but I'm going to go ahead and experiment and just see if they sound a little bit better at a different pitch over the pattern. Yeah, I think the kick sounds better pitched up a little bit like that. The main thing I'm looking for when I'm pitching the kick is not to have it interfere with the bass. That's one of the hardest things about mixing is trying to get the low end right. And the kick and the bass are what live in that low end. So making sure they don't clash is important. Let's check out the snare. Let's see if we can change the pitch on the snare at all. those higher pitches work, and it's sort of a preference thing, but I kind of like the original pitch of it. It's a bit on the lower side, and I think it fits really well with the sample. So I've obviously got sort of a basic drum pattern going with some basic finger drumming. I'm going to try to brainstorm some other patterns that might work right now and adjust the samples if needed to fit into those patterns. One thing I did was I filled up this entire bank with samples because I wanted as much stuff to experiment with as possible. So right now I just want to make sure that whatever I can use on this bank I'm using, and I'm going to make those samples sound really good right now before I start recording into the pattern. So yeah, I think this snap sounds really good, but it's very dry sounding. It could use some reverb, so I'm going to resample it with some reverb real quick here. All right, that's a little bit too much reverb, but I can actually just fix it by using an envelope. Go ahead and move the end of it over. There we go. The other thing I want to do while I'm here is have a closed hi-hat and an open hi-hat. And I want the closed hi-hat to cut off the open hi-hat. So I'm going to go ahead and put both of those in a mute group by hitting Shift 8, finding an empty mute group and putting them in that. Nice. So I think now I'm ready to start recording the drums into a pattern, and I want to create a number of variations on the drum beat. So I want to have some different patterns where some of them are busier with more drums and some are more sparse with fewer drums. And there's a couple different ways I can do that. One of which is that I can start with a sparse pattern and then copy it over, add some more drums, copy it over, add some more drums. Or you can go the other way. I can start with a whole bunch of different drums and then copy that pattern over with just some of the drums as opposed to all the drums. In this case, I'm hearing a couple different drum patterns in my head, one of which is the more syncopated kick and snare. And the other is more of a 4 on the floor feel with the kick, so it's just kicks on all fours. So I think I'll start with some more basic patterns and then add on to those two different patterns as I go. So let's hop over to the pattern here. Now, an important thing to note when you're playing the drums into a pattern is whether you're on fixed velocity or not, which you can enable or disable by hitting Shift 1 here. And fixed velocity just means everything's going to be maximum volume, no matter how hard you hit the pads. For some drum patterns, they actually sound really good, just full volume on every single hit. But other times you're going to want a more natural feel where certain hits will be much louder than others. In this case, I've got a natural sounding drum pattern. I've got a natural sample that I'm playing over. I want to give it a natural feel where there's a little bit of a bounce to it. So I'm not going to use fixed velocity. I'm going to turn that off. So because I know I want at least two very different drum patterns, I'm going to go ahead and copy the sample pattern over to another pad. So maybe these will be my 4 on the floor patterns, and then these will be my more syncopated patterns. And while I'm here, I'll also just copy this first pattern onto the second pad, and I'll leave this first pattern as just a pattern with no drums on it at all, because that might be useful when I'm putting together the full track. All right, let's go ahead and record over the second pattern here. So in the record settings here, I can use this right dial to change the quantization, which is just going to force the drum beats to be on the grid or not. Now, I have a feeling this sample is a bit kind of off grid and not really lined up with the individual like quarter notes and eighth notes and stuff. So I'm probably going to want to turn the quantization off. But one thing I always like to do is make sure the very first beat of the pattern is fully quantized. So I'm going to go ahead and record and just put a kick drum, a nice loud kick drum, right on beat 1. So now I can go ahead and turn the quantization off while I'm still recording here. Also, if you have the metronome on like this, you can hear how the metronome is almost lined up with the sample, but not quite. So you can just turn it off by hitting Shift 9 here. And now I want to start layering in those other kicks. Cool, that's sounding pretty good. Let's go ahead and copy that over. And let's go ahead and add the snaps on 2 and 4 here. So now I'll go ahead and copy this onto another pattern. And I think for this one, I want to fill at the end of that 2 bar to lead into a totally different pattern. So I'm just going to go ahead and record a fill at the very end of that. So now let's move down to our more syncopated drum pattern and start recording on that. Now I'm an okay-ish finger drummer, certainly not amazing, but when I'm finger drumming, I find that the more drums I try to play at once, the worse they sound because I'm getting a little bit off of the beat the more stuff I add. So when I'm recording into a pattern, I just record in layers, so I like to keep everything really basic. So the very first thing I'm going to record is just kick and snare. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll go ahead and turn the quantization all the way back up for that first kick. And then I'll turn it back down for everything else. So in this pattern, I think I'll record in some hi-hat. So now we'll copy that over again, and let's add some more kicks to this one. I think this could use a lot more kicks in it. I'm also going to add some open hi-hats to this one. That sounded pretty good so far. The other thing that I'm really going to need is some crashes, and the crashes are going to fall on beat 1 of a pattern, even though I'm not really sure where the fills are going to be. So I just need some different patterns to have crashes on beat 1. So I know this is going to be sort of my main pattern because it just sounds the most right with the groove. So I'm definitely going to need one of these with the crash at the front, and then I'll probably take one of the 4 on the floor ones and put a crash on the front as well. So let's go ahead and copy this one over. And I'll put a quantized crash right at the beginning of that one. So I'll turn the quantization back up, start recording. And then to show you what that will sound like, I'll play one of the patterns with a fill in it going into the pattern with the crash at the beginning of it. So you can already start to hear the different kind of sections coming together and the different variations on the sections that I'll be able to alternate when I'm creating an actual track. The one other really useful tool for creating pattern variations is copying a pattern over, but only copying some of the samples over. So let's say, for example, I want to take this pattern and get rid of the hi-hat in it. What you can do is you can hit copy and then copy this pattern over. And then you see it says remain samples to copy. That means you can hit remain, and then you can pick which samples you want to copy over. So I'm going to copy the main sample. And then as far as the drums go, I'll copy the kick, snare, but not the hi-hats, but I'll take those 2 toms. Then I hit copy, and now I've got the same pattern variation just without that hi-hat in it. So that's already a lot of good stuff to start putting a track together. The other thing I might put in here for percussion is a drum loop of something like a shaker or a tambourine or something that has a bit of a texture to it that kind of lasts over the course of a 2-bar phrase. I really love shaker and tambourine. I think shaker would work really well on this. But that's pretty simple. You just grab a loop that you think sounds good and you just toss it in there. But this is the general method that I tend to use for making drum patterns that sound kind of interesting and unique. So hopefully you found this helpful. If you have, please consider liking and subscribing. It would really help me out a lot, and I'd really appreciate it. And other than that, I'll catch you next time. Later.